Is it working? Oh, not working.
Not yet. Just okay. I'm just going to make you the host, and then you should be fine.
Okay.
Okay. Can you try that now?
Yeah. You go eat. Yeah, I think we're good.
Okay.
Where is it? There we go. Okay, it works.
Great.
Whoa. Stop share. Okay. Is it time? Yeah, it's time. Okay.
Okay. And I believe it's recording as well. Can you see that on your screen?
Yes, I can see it. We're starting.
Okay. Perfect.
Are we here? We're here. Okay, we're good. Okay. Is my fan making noise?
No.
No. Okay, then let's start. Okay. So this past week we read Parshat Behaalotecha. It's an eclectic mix of stuff. I want to take a step back from the broad and abstract ideas that we were talking about for the last few weeks and focus a little more on the Parsha directly. So let's go to the beginning of the Parsha. Okay, this is not the beginning of the Parsha. This is beginning of chapter 10. Aseh lecha shtei chatzotzot kesef, mikshah taseh otam vayu lecha lemikra ha'eda ulemasa et hamachanot. Moshe is being commanded to make for himself 2 silver trumpets. I translated it literally, the lecha, because Chazal used that lecha as a medrash halacha that Moshe himself, they're being made for Moshe, and for much of the use of these trumpets is limited to the generation of the desert. So Chazal look at the lecha on a very personal level, that this applies to Moshe and not Lidorot. Okay, but let's see what these trumpets do, because it has many tasks for these trumpets, and some of which are Lidorot and some of which aren't. They're being used to summon the entire nation to assemble around the Mishkan. But if they only blow once, then the Nisim will gather. It's a meeting of the leadership.
Sorry, you're translating that as if they only blow once? Sorry.
Yeah,
Oh.
I think so. But
you look at Gimel and Dalet. Gimel is V'tak'u b'hen, and Dalet is V'im ba'achat.
Yeah, I guess you could say if they blew only one of them, but how would anyone know that it's one blowing rather than 2?
That was my other question. If you hadn't translated it as you did.
Yeah, but you know what? I wasn't really thinking about that. I don't know. This is not a din lidorot, so I'm not taking it too seriously. So then they would blow again, and they would start marching. The eastern encampment would march first, followed by the southern encampment. They would work counterclockwise, and the whole thing would move. The diamond arrangement would rotate, and they'd eventually end up marching in a row. We think. Okay. And if you want to gather the nation, you would blow a tekiah, not a truah, a long and opposed to a rapid staccato. Who would do the blowing of these trumpets? The Kohanim. וכי תבואו מלחמה בארצכם, על הצר הצורר אתכם, וראיתם החצוצות ונזכרתם לפני אדוני אלוהיכם, ונושעתם מאויביכם. In times of war, and Rambam is going to expand this to not just war, but in times of war, they would blow the trumpets. V'nizkartem lifnei Hashem Elokechem. We're going to need to understand that. To some degree, it defies translation. Uv'yom simchatchem uv'mordechem, and on your holidays, and on Rosh Chodesh. Utekatem b'chatzotzot al olotechem v'al zivchei shamechem v'ayu lachem lezikaron lifnei Adonai Elohechem ani Adonai Elohechem. Again, the mirror image of war. On the celebratory days in the Mikdash, they would blow the trumpets while they were bringing the karbanot. And again, similar language, Vayu lachem lezikaron. We need to address, what does that mean? Okay. In Hilchot Ta'anit, Rambam brings a... Well, first, let's go back and look just at the psukim. These trumpets are multi-use. They gather the people, they gather the leadership, they signal departure. They signal departure from the encampment, and they would blow the trumpets at times of war and other distress. And they would blow the trumpets during celebrations. It's an eclectic mix. What's the common theme here? I'm not sure there is a common theme, but let's look for one. The Rambam in Hilchot Ta'aniyot, mitzvah taseh min Torah liz'ok, that means in modern Hebrew it's ok, cry out, lahariya b'chatzotzot al kol tzara shetavo al hatzibur. So now it's no longer just a war. It's al hatzara tzorer, any horrible negative thing, whether it's a famine or a drought or a war or an invasion or a plague. They would, as part of Hilchot Ta'aniyot, they would gather in prayer. They would blow the trumpets. This is about doing tshuva. But if you refuse to call out to God and declare that all the negative things that befall the nation are merely happenstance, if these are all things that that we do not ascribe to God, then here Rambam, he's invoking the psukim from the Tochacha. If you declare things just to be mikre, v'alachtem imi keri, v'halachti gam ani imachem b'chamat keri. If you treat it as happenstance, God will respond and abandon us to happenstance. We will not be protected. We will not enjoy the divine hashgacha. So Rambam takes the trumpets of Parshat Behaalotecha and ascribes them to Hilchot Ta'aniyot. Rambam does something somewhat interesting. Mitzvah Taseh, number 5. The last couple of weeks we did Mitzvah Taseh 1, 2, 3, and 4. This week we're doing 5. This is not some secret plan of mine. It just worked out that way. It's serendipitous, but I did not plan to get to Mitzvah Taseh 5, but here we are. The Mitzvah of Tefillah. How does Rambam word the Mitzvah of Tefillah? Tzivanu la'avdo. Says that we have to v'avadtem et Hashem Elokechem. So we are commanded to worship God, and v'oto ta'avodu. What does it mean to worship God? ואף על פי שזה הציווי, הוא גם כן מהציוויים הכלולים כמו שביארנו בשורש ד', הנה יש פה ייחוד אחר שהוא ציווי לתפילה. Rambam sees the command, ועבדתם את השם אלוקיכם, as a command to engage in prayer. Ramban is very upset. Ramban, in his critique to the Rambam Sefer Mitzvot, says, I cannot find a source anywhere in the Torah that commands us to pray. Show me the pasuk. Voto ta'avodu. Why is avodah prayer? Now, we've accustomed ourselves to this idea that avodah is prayer, and Rambam himself says, avodah shabalev is tefillah. Ramban is not against prayer. Don't misunderstand him. Ramban simply thinks that the command to pray is subsumed in this next mitzvah to say 59. We jumped from 5 to 59. Okay? But Rambam also has in there the command to blow the trumpets, or call it tzar hatzorer. What's going on between the Rambam and the Ramban here? Rambam is saying that there are two separate commands: to pray in general and to cry out to God in crisis, which is also a form of prayer. So Ramban says there is no independent command to pray. The only overt pasuk that relates to prayer in the Torah is the one in Behaalotecha, that when we are in distress, we need to call out to God. Rav Soloveitchik, quoting his grandfather, rather famously, Rav Soloveitchik, one second, I have to do something. Okay. Rav Soloveitchik, rather famously, tries to synchronize. That's not the right word. It's not the word I want.
Coordinate?
Yeah, there's a better word, something with an S. But to bring them into agreement by suggesting that for Ramban, our very daily existence is an existential crisis. So, yes, it's true that you only have to pray when you're in crisis, but when are you not in crisis? You're always in crisis. So he tries to smooth it over, but the halakha, there's a very big difference. Just for example, on any given day, you've already prayed, and now there's a crisis. Have you fulfilled your obligation? Surely not. Because the requirement to pray in crisis is completely independent from the requirement to pray on an ongoing basis. Additionally, the laws of tefillah are such that we don't actually require absolute concentration and understanding, what we'll call kavanah, during our daily prayers. To the contrary, the poskim are very strict that we have to have kavanah for the first two brachot of the Amidah. Fine, the first two brachot. The rest of the tefillah can have some general kavanah, an awareness that one is praying, that one is standing before God. And you don't need to understand the words, and you don't need to concentrate on them, except for those first two brachot. Whereas the crying out in anguish of tzarot sorer, that clearly requires concentration. One cannot cry out in distress by rote. It just doesn't work. Okay? But look what Rambam did in Mitzvah Nun Tet. We have a requirement to blow the trumpets in the Mikdash when we're bringing the festival sacrifices. And where's his proof text? Rambam has linked the trumpets of festival sacrifices and the trumpets of distress as one mitzvah. A couple of weeks ago, we were talking about Rambam's methodology in Sefer Mitzvot, and we were talking about how Rambam unlinked the mitzvah taseh and the mitzvah lo taseh of Shemitah and created a positive, that's not right, recognized in the Torah text a positive mitzvah of having the land rest, in addition to the mitzvah lo taseh, you may not plant and you may not harvest. And we explained that there's the positive element of doing a mitzvah, which is more of an abstract concept, and the forbidden element of violating the mitzvah, which is something to do or to not do. And here, Rambam, and he certainly is criticized for this by many of the following generations, of why is Rambam linking what seems to be completely disparate mitzvot, the seemingly triumphant trumpets of the holiday korbanot, together with the distressful call to battle of the trumpets of war or disaster. Why does Rambam connect them? Before I answer that, and I will, I want to look at a couple of hidden instances of the appearances of the trumpets. First of all, we have, and one thing we're seeing is that Rambam will have the halachot spread out all over the place. We'll see in that in Sefer Mitzvot, and again, we're a little bit talking about methodology. In Sefer Mitzvot, he's got the trumpets of the korban and the trumpets of distress in one place, together. Why? Because they appear together in the Torah. So he has them as one mitzvah. He considers them one mitzvah. We're going to have to talk about how are they in any way one mitzvah. But besides that, the actualization of the mitzvah is spread out throughout the whole of the book. We saw it in Hilchot Ta'aniyot. We're going to see it here, and there are a number of places, but we'll see it here in Hilchot Klei Mikdash. So now he's talking about the trumpets themselves. B'mei ha'ma'odot kulam u'v'roshei chodashim, on all the festivals and on Rosh Chodesh, the Kohanim would blow their trumpets during the bringing of the korbanot. Okay? And again, the proof text is going to be the same for all of them. Okay. And then it shows up again. In the Chol Chagiga, and he's not talking about Chagiga here, he's talking about the mitzvah of Hakel. Tokim b'chatzasrot b'chol Yerushalayim kidei lahakil et ha'am. On the Sukkot, after the Shnat Shemitah, the entire nation would gather for the mitzvah of Hakel once every 7 years, and the king would be brought a Sefer Torah, and he would read the Torah to all the people. Who knows what they heard, who knows what they understood, but they were gathered by the blowing of these same trumpets. And you really need to ask yourself, this is not a question on the Rambam. It's really a question on the Torah. We've got a string of psukim here in Behaalotecha. We're introduced to the trumpets, and then we're given 4 uses of the trumpets, and then we see that there's more. We've got Hakel. It's all lumped together in the Torah as if there's some common denominator to these trumpets. We could very happily call this the chapter of the trumpets. And all these completely not related elements are brought together by the Pasuk. This is not the Rambam's doing, but the Rambam is treating them as one mitzvah. So I'm forced to ask, what is that one mitzvah? What do these mitzvot have in common that they are linked by trumpets? Okay. Let's look at the Mishnayot in Rosh Hashanah. Chapter 3 of Mishnah Rosh Hashanah. Interestingly, at no point in Mishnah Rosh Hashanah are we ever actually told that we need to blow the shofar in Rosh Hashanah. Now, if I ask you, what are the mitzvot of Rosh Hashanah? That's already a misleading question, because there are no mitzvot of Rosh Hashanah. There is one mitzvah of Rosh Hashanah, and that is to hear the shofar. Not to blow the shofar, to hear it. And the bracha we make, granted this is a machloket in the Rishonim, but the bracha we make is lishmoa kol shofar. But nowhere in the Mishnah of Rosh Hashanah does anyone ask, how do you know that there even is a mitzvah to hear the shofar? And the truth is, if I were to hand you a chumash and tell you to go find it, you'd have a lot of trouble finding the command to hear the shofar in Rosh Hashanah. And you'd have trouble finding it because it's not there. Rosh Hashanah is mentioned twice in the Torah text. Once in Parshat Emor, where it says, Zichron Tru'ah, that Rosh Hashanah is the memory of the blowing. What memory? What am I remembering? And if I remember that a shofar was blowing, assuming that Zichron Tru'ah is the memory of the blowing of a shofar, so perhaps this is a celebration of Matan Torah when we heard the Kolot Shofar on Har Sinai. What is this Zichron Tru'ah? And then in Parshat Pinchas, in the discussion of the Korbanot Musaf, the extra Korbanot that are brought on each of the holidays, Rosh Hashanah is introduced as Yom Tru'ah Yelachem. On the first day of the 7th month, that is the 1st of Tishrei, is Yom Tru'ah. That's the entirety of it. At no point is there a command as such to blow the shofar. It's just assumed by the text. Yom Tru'ah Yelachem. So the Mishnah says, okay, so the Mishnah doesn't even discuss, the Gemara discusses, but the Mishnah never discusses, how do you know that there's a chiyuv of shofar? No. The Mishnah goes straight from discussing the establishment of the day of Rosh Hashanah by the witnesses seeing the new moon, and which witnesses we trust and which witnesses we don't trust. And they would finally accept the witnesses, declare the new moon, declare the new moon. That means today is Rosh Hashanah. If today is Rosh Hashanah, we need to blow shofar. But they don't actually say that. They just say, Kol ha-shofarot ksherim chutz mishel parah. Doesn't matter what animal you take it from. You take the horn of an animal and you blow it. That's a shofar. B'ta'niyot b'shel zcharim. The machloket, do they need to be from male animals, female animals? Are they to be straight? Are they to be curved? When it says pihen mitzupim b'kesef, that's sort of misleading. What it really means is everything but the tip can be coated. The handle, the body of the shofar and the chatzitzot are made of silver, but the shofar, when it says pihen mitzupim b'kesef, in other words, you can plate for ornamental purposes the shofar with gold or silver, except for the part where the mouth needs to touch, because that would otherwise be a chatzitza, okay? And in the mikdash, they would blow the shofar together with chatzotzrot on the ta'aniyot, okay? And now we have the laws. of, as long as we're talking about blowing shofar, so we talk about blowing shofar to introduce the Yovel year once every 50 years. And then we have the laws of a cracked and perforated shofar. Can you fix it? Can you not fix it? Everything's very nice. You have to hear the actual sound of the shofar, not an echo. Good. And at the end of that discussion, it says, if one is passing by the shul and he hears that they're blowing shofar, was he yotzei the mitzvah of shofar? Answers the Mishnah, im chiven libo yatsa, v'im lav lo yatsa. So it comes down to, was he paying attention or not? If he was paying attention, im chiven libo, even though he was just randomly passing by, okay. So then he's yotzei yedei chova. So once we mention the concept of kivun libo, of deliberately listening, so now the Mishnah talks about the famous but confusing Mishnah. When Moshe was during Mechemet Amalek, when Moshe was standing on top of the mountain, holding up his hands, and the pasuk says that Vayak Asher Yarim Moshe Yado v'Gavar Yisrael. So v'Chasher Yaniach Yado v'Gavar Amalek v'Chi Yadav Shem Oseh Oseh Milchama Ushavro Milchama. Moshe's hands being in the air or not control the outcome of the war? Surely not. But rather, if im kivnu libam, if they were focused in prayer while they were in battle, they had the proper intentions of fighting God's battles, then they would win. And similarly, when we get to Parshat Chukat, we have the story of the punishment that God gave Bnei Israel who were complaining once again about the conditions in the desert. And God says, you want to see desert? I'll show you desert. You think I haven't been taking care of you all these years? Let's see how you do with snakes and scorpions. And God releases. He doesn't inflict them with snakes and scorpions. The language there is very passive. God merely releases the snakes and scorpions that were there all along and simply withdraws his hand of protective hand, and suddenly Bnei Israel are dying right and left. And God gives Moshe the antidote. He says, make a snake and put it on the sticks and wave it for them from all to see. This copper snake causes people to live or die? Rather not, no. Again, their attention is focused in prayer, they were healed. And if not, they would die. I think this Mishnah, which is immediately directly part of the Mishnah dealing with the shofar of Rosh Hashanah, will help us understand what's going on with the trumpets in general. I think I've sufficiently hinted, without saying it overtly, so now it's time to say it overtly. What is the purpose of the shofar? What is the purpose of the trumpets? The purpose of the trumpets in the psukim is clearly about getting people's attention for different activities. Getting their attention when you want the people to gather, well, yeah, right? You want to call the people to come? You blow a trumpet. You want the Nisim to come to a meeting? You blow a different trumpet, or you blow it differently. You want people to travel? It's time to set out? You blow a trumpet. I think there was a time where in the military, at least the British military, they would use whistles. Moshe used a trumpet. You want to gather the people? Blow the shofar. When there is Tsar HaTzorer, where there is disaster among the people, and you need to gather them in prayer or for communal fasts, and a communal fast always is accompanied by prayer. It's meaningless to have just a fast without prayer. So they would blow the trumpets. Now we need to be a little more specific. What does blowing the trumpet do? What does blowing the shofar do on Rosh Hashanah? And how is this connected to blowing the trumpets when we are presumably joyously bringing the korbanot to the festival? Again, I think the answer yes is getting people's attention. But what is it that we're trying to do? What are we accomplishing? Let's go back to Rosh Hashanah. Why do we blow shofar in Rosh Hashanah? What is the meaning? What is the act? So Rambam himself, I didn't bother bringing the quote. He says, the reason is not given, but there's a hint. It's to awaken you from your complacency. Oru yishenim, wake up, you sleepy people. Awaken from your complacency and do tshuva. But as Rambam himself says, that there's just a hint to it. There's no overt explanation. And I think it's just as legitimate to say, and I'm certainly not the first to suggest this, that the blowing of the shofar is a universal, one size fits all, and I mean that in the most positive way. It is almost an animal cry. It's a silent tefillah. It's a tefillah that includes all other tefillot. And we listen to it. We join ourselves to it. We are all sharing the tkiyah of Rosh Hashanah. So what is the tkiyat shofar of Rosh Hashanah? What is the tkiyat shofar of a fast day? What is the tkiyat shofar of a celebratory day? It's a prayer. It's a wordless prayer. But what does that have to do with korbanot? So let's talk about that. First of all, I want to get back to Rambam's methodology, and then we'll get back to answering the question. We asked earlier, why does Rambam throw together in the Sefer Mitzvot, the chatzotzrot of the Mikdash on the festivals and the Tzar HaTzorer? It makes no sense. Why are those one mitzvah? And I think the correct answer is they are one mitzvah because they are accomplished in an identical fashion. And I'm going to argue they serve an identical purpose, which then forces me to explain what that identical purpose is. But they serve an identical purpose. They are performed exactly the same way. And therefore, as far as Rambam is concerned, they are one mitzvah. They are two different aspects of the same mitzvah. So let's go down to something that has nothing to do with what we're talking about. Mitzvah Tazeh 87. He's talking about the korban of mechusarei kapara, people who are in the middle of a process of tshuva. In this case, we're talking about a mitzorah. It doesn't matter. There's a multi-step process, and part of the process is to bring a korban. And Rambam is explaining that there are many different forms of the korban mechusarei kapara, and he feels obligated to justify that each one of these, and he's numerating them. This is the Revi'i, okay, of the Mechusarei Kapara. And he feels obligated here, in the middle of nowhere, to explain, why is he doing this? Surely, all the Mechusarei Kapara that have to bring a korban, there's no real difference between them. Someone learning these halachot would look at it and say, I really don't understand why you put together blowing the trumpets for both holidays and disasters, But these michusarei kapara that are identical, you insist on listing separately. And Rambam, anticipating that challenge, he says, Omnam mitzad hitchalvut korbanam k'mo she'ata ro'eh, hitchayev limnot kol korban b'yichud be'echreach. I have no choice but to list them separately, even though you think they look the same, because they're not actually the same. In what sense are they not actually the same? Hitchalfut korbanam. The actual korban, whether it's a ram or a goat or a bird or two birds, each of those korbanot is ever so slightly different. How can I list them together in one mitzvah when the performance of the mitzvah is going to be so drastically different? And Rambam is giving us an insight to his thought process. These are separate mitzvot because they are performed differently, whereas the chatzotzrot are performed identically and their purpose is the same. In which case, I really need to ask myself, what do I mean that purpose is the same? I want to look at another example of this before we tie all the loose ends together. At the beginning of Hilchot Tshuva, Rambam says that the key to Tshuva is vidui. Anytime someone sinned, whether on purpose or inadvertently, when he does Tshuva, lehitvadot, vidui. Okay, vidui is good. It's the central mitzvah of Tshuva. It's the opening mitzvah of Tshuva because it is the very essence of Tshuva, is vidui, confession. But in reviewing the exact same vidui in the Sefer Mitzvot, it's not part of Hilchot Tshuva overtly, but rather when one brings a korban, you need to make the korban as part of a process of Tshuva, and you have to say a vidui. And what do I mean by a vidui? What does he have to say? He says, Ana Hashem chatati aviti pashati asiti kach v'kach v'yaricha mamar. He should just continue talking. He knows what he needs to say. He knows what sins he committed. V'yaricha mamar v'yivakesh mechila b'zeh anyan lefi tzachut l'shono. He simply needs to express himself as best as he knows how. Now, Rambam is certainly treating the mitzvah vidui very differently. In the Sefer Mitzvot, it's buried in among the korbanot. He doesn't have a separate mitzvah vidui in the Sefer Mitzvot. Whereas Hilchot Tshuva, which Rambam separates out and brings to the very front of his Mishneh Torah, and in the opening of Hilchot Tshuva, vidui gets pride of place as the most important aspect of Tshuva. And you could say, well, that's intuitive. Yes, it is intuitive. Nevertheless, he makes it central. He draws your attention to it. And the truth is, for Rambam, Hilchot Tshuva, no, the concept of Tshuva, not Hilchot Tshuva, the concept of Tshuva is Rambam's secret weapon. You know, everyone knows that Rambam did almost everything in groups of 14. Forgetting about why, because I'm not sure I know why. I think I might know why, but it's not important. The Mishneh Torah is divided up. That's why it's called Yada Chazakah, 14. 14 books of halakha is the Mishneh Torah. And within the Moreh Nevuchim, he divides the mitzvot up into 14 categories. And so many different places Rambam focuses on 14. And then famously, he's got his 13 principles of faith in the introduction to Perek Chelek in Masechet Sanhedrin. And so many have asked, I don't understand. He couldn't have found a 14th principle of faith? Why did he stop at 13? But elsewhere, he tells us that for Rambam, the overarching Yesod that includes and subsumes All the others, the 14th, which is really the first, is tshuva. Because in our world, as humans, physical humans with emotions and physical needs and Yetzer Hara, if we didn't have the opportunity for tshuva, and if God doesn't give us the opportunity for mechila, we couldn't function, we couldn't live, we psychologically we would collapse, and physically we would collapse, and be constant state of sin and punishment. Tshuva is the only way we can survive in the world. It's the overarching principle that all the other 13 must defer to tshuva. Okay. So Rambam, why do I mention it? Because it's nothing to do with what we're talking about. In terms of his methodology, in the Mishnah Torah, there's a hierarchy. In the Sefer HaMitzvot, he takes the mitzvot. He does create a hierarchy, but the organizational system of the Sefer HaMitzvot is not strictly hierarchy 1 through 360. It's more about categories and how things appear in the Torah. So let's get back to the question that we opened with. What is the common denominator that ties together the Chatzotzrot? Why are the Chatzotzrot? They've got, we had 4 or 5 or 6 different tasks that were being fulfilled by the Chatzotzrot. What are they doing? What do they have in common? How can the Rambam throw together the Chatzotzrot of the celebratory korbanot of the Chag and the Tzar HaTzorer, the public gathering for going to war or battling a plague or a famine? And I think it's fair to suggest that the common denominator for the trumpets, and I said it earlier, is focusing our attention. What is tefillah? What is avodah shabalev? We ask God for permission to address him and spill out our hearts before him, expressing our awe, our shevach, hodaya, our thanks, and our bakashot. And what I'd like to suggest, and this is not a big idea. I think it's overt. I think it's obvious for anyone if we think about it, but we need to think about it a little more often. That crying out in pain to God when we're suffering and thanking God, let's say the korbanot of the Chag, are two sides of the same coin. They are about acknowledging God's dominion in the world. What in Rambam jargon we'll call hashgacha. And that we are subjects of God in this world. So that when we sin, we need to request God's forgiveness in order for us to survive. When there are crises, we need to understand, and this is Rambam emphasized in the beginning of Hilchot Taniyot, if we make believe that everything is simply happenstance, God will never come and give us protection and guidance. When bad things happen to us, we need to acknowledge that we are either the direct or the indirect cause of the suffering that has befallen us. And when things are going good for us, we need to acknowledge that God has done good for us, hopefully because we've earned it. And we need to do introspection there too and say, what did I do to earn it so I can continue doing it? So the celebratory korbanot of the Chagim, when we gather in the Mikdash before God and to give our thanks, Or when we gather in our shuls to pray to be relieved of a plague or a famine or going to war, it's the same idea. We're praying for God's guidance, whether it's the continuation of his blessings or protection from things going badly. They're the same concept. And the silent cry of the shofar, the universal prayer, the wordless prayer of the shofar or the trumpet, gives us all a common language. And as the Rambam says, each of us should be adding our own words, our own ideas, our own feelings with contemplation and introspection. But for the Rambam, they really are just one mitzvah. And therefore, he includes them in one mitzvah in the Sefer Mitzvot. Zeu. Let us unmute everybody. How do you do that? I don't know. Yeah, unmute everybody.
Hi.
Okay, talk. Sing. Do something.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. And a word from the sponsors. If anyone can make it to the minyan tomorrow at 7:45, that would be lovely.
Yes, it was great fun today.
So I heard.
Very select crowd.
Well, it's safe for everyone to come out because it's anything but public.
Yes, correct. There are more people in your home than there are in shul.
Yes, so join us for shul tomorrow morning. Okay, Shavua Tov, everyone.
Shavua Tov. Thank you very much, Nachum.
What? Say something. Who said that?
Leah?
Shavua Tov, Leah.
Hi, Nachum.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Okay. How do I turn this off? Stop recording. Here we go. Stop recording. Mark, you there? Mark's not there. So, I don't know. Let's see. Do I want to stop cloud recording?